Let's take a look at the determinants of supply. So these are things that are going to shift our entire supply curve over to the right, or it's going to shift our entire supply curve over to the left. Just to reiterate a few things that we said on the determinants of demand. So number one, these are all non-price factors. So everything that you see right here has nothing to do with the current price of the good, because this is going to be, once again, the differentiation between a change in supply versus a change in quantity supply. Number two, these are the only things that affect supply. So there are a few other things that you might think that affect supply, but remember, if we don't bring it up, we cannot say it's going to affect supply. And then finally, number three, we are only going to be doing these shifts in one particular direction just for time's sake. If you want to go ahead and see what happens in the opposite case, just change everything to the opposite side. So let's go ahead, draw out these graphs once again, and use a little bit of intuition to see how all of these determinants right here are going to be affecting our supply curve. First one that we see right there is production technology. Production technology. And production technology refers to exactly what type of technology do we have in order to produce this particular good or service that we take a look at in a particular market. So once again, just build up our supply curve with the Cartesian plane. We have price, we have quantity, and let's suppose that we're taking a look at the market for television, so TVs right here. And of course, we always want to start off with our benchmark case. We have S0 right here. S0, remember, we always want to label these sort of things so we know where we're starting off and then where we're going to be going. So suppose that we go ahead and have, say, in this particular market for televisions, that the technology to make televisions improves. So the specific shock is tech to make TVs improves. And the general shock, we can just go ahead and say that there's some type of positive technological shock. So positive tech shock. So something happens within the television industry that says that, hey, firms, producers can actually produce more televisions because we have a improvement in technology. So what does this mean for our supply curve? It tells us that because we are now being more efficient in our production processes, we can go ahead and produce or supply more televisions. So anytime we have an increase in supply, we're going to shift our entire supply curve over to the right or away from the origin. So in this instance, we shift it over to the right to S1 here. So this is one of the main reasons why we don't say up or down, because down is actually towards the right, and that really doesn't sort of make wordplay sense in this sort of case. So here we always just want to stick to right and left, or increase and decrease, away from the origin towards the origin, that type of thing. So with this, what does this tell us about the supply for these televisions? It tells us that suppliers are willing and able to supply more at every single price. So remember, with a constant price, P0 right here, before initially we were at S0, on the supply curve, our initial supply curve, we had a quantity supplied of Q0, but now at the same exact price of P0, we end up on an entirely new supply curve, S1 right here, and we end up with a quantity supplied of Q1. So just like in terms of demand, we notice that on the supply side, suppliers are willing and able to supply more at every single price. So suppliers are willing and able to supply more at every single price. Supply more at every single price. Every single price. And of course, just for completion, if we wanted to go ahead and do the opposite case, if we had a negative tech shock, so what happens if the tech for televisions deteriorates, then we shift our supply curve over to the left. We go from S1 to S0, and suppliers are less willing and less able to supply more at every single price. Essentially, they're going to be supplying less at every single price. So we shift the supply curve over to the left towards the origin. So far, so good. We can move to our next determinant, which is going to be the cost of resources. So here, determinant number 2 on the supply side, cost of resources. And cost of resources tells us that these suppliers, these firms, they actually need to go ahead and incur some type of cost in order to make some type of good. These can be labor costs, these can be raw material costs. If we just need to use it in order to produce the final good, it would fall under some type of input or resource. So let's go ahead and build up our graph once again. If you have a major in economics, you're going to be drawing thousands of these graphs. It's absolutely fantastic. So here, price, quantity, supply 0, our initial supply curve. And let's go ahead and take a look at the market for guacamole. So guacamole. So delicious, delicious guacamole. And what exactly do you need in order to make or supply guacamole? You need avocados. So avocados is a resource in the production of guacamole. So let's go ahead and say the price of avocados, what happens if the price of avocados increases? So once again, the general shock, I'm going to say cost of resources or inputs increase. Cost of resources / inputs increases. So price of avocados increases. What is that going to do to guacamole production? Can we supply more or are we going to supply less guacamole? Because avocados are used in the production of guacamole, if the price of avocados increase, it tells us that we're going to be selling less guacamole, so our supply curve shifts over to the left towards the origin. So therefore, anytime the cost of an input, if labor costs increase, if raw material cost increases, if any cost of an input increases, then we're going to supply less of this particular good. Third determinant, we take a look at the prices of related commodities. Prices of related commodities. And once again, this has nothing to do with the current price of the good. It's a price of a related commodity. So it's still a non-price determinant. Let's go ahead and take a look at this example right here. So here we have price, we have quantity. Start off with S0 right here. And say we're taking a look at the pineapple market. Pineapple. So the price of related commodities just tells us that you as a supplier, you as a producer actually have a little bit of flexibility in what you want to bring out into the marketplace. In this example, suppose that you have a choice of selling pineapples or supplying mangoes. So you own a little farm and you can either be a pineapple farmer or you can be a mango farmer. And we want to see exactly what happens to the supply of pineapples when the price of mangoes changes. So let's go ahead and say that the price of mangoes increases. Price of mangoes increases. So that's the specific example for this particular supply curve. The general shock is going to be the price of related commodities increases. Price of related commodities increases. So here, if the price of mangoes increases, do you want to start growing pineapples or do you want to not grow pineapples? So one thing that we want to be clearly differentiating about is that the price is not the same as the cost. So the cost is exactly that. It tells you exactly what it's going to cost you to make this particular good. The price, on the other hand, is what you are receiving for selling this particular good. So if the price of mangoes goes up, it tells you that the price you're receiving for growing mangoes has done that, exactly that, it has gone up. So given a choice, if the price of mangoes increases compared to the price of pineapples, what are you more incentivized to start growing as a farmer? Mangoes or pineapples? You're going to go ahead and want to start producing or farming more mangoes instead because the price you're receiving is relatively higher. So what does this mean for the pineapple market? It tells us that you are not actually going to be farming pineapples. You're not going to be growing pineapples. You're going to go ahead and devote all of your resources to growing mangoes instead. So in the pineapple market, it tells you that the supply is going to go down in this instance. So here, decrease in supply, in the pineapple market, you shift the supply curve over to the left. So once again, this is probably the most confusing one determinant out of all the ones that we take a look on the supply side. Here, price is not the same as cost, so you do want to be a little bit aware of that differentiation. So once again, hey, you just want to be a little bit cognizant about exactly what is increasing, what is decreasing, and what that means for related commodities. Next, we go ahead and take a look at expectations. So expectations about future prices. Expectations about future prices. And once again, it's a non-price determinant because it's talking about future prices and not current prices. And with these expectations about future prices, we tend to see a lot of supply changing depending on a lot of commodities or collectibles. So here, start off with S0. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the market for Beanie Babies. Beanie Babies. So if you don't know what Beanie Babies are, that makes me feel a little bit old, but Beanie Babies were these hugely popular and hugely collectible little stuffed animals in the 90s, and people used to go crazy about these little stuffed animals. So they used to sell them at McDonald's, they used to sell them in their Happy Meals, they used to sell them at toy stores, Toys R Us, and people went crazy for them because they thought that these Beanie Babies would be very, very highly collectible and worth a lot of money down the line. However, today, I'm going to say that at least 99.9% of these Beanie Babies are completely worthless. I think there's only maybe one or two that might be somewhat valuable. There's one Princess Diana Beanie Baby. I think that's worth roughly about maybe maybe $12,000, but I'm not really sure if anyone would actually want to pay that price. But essentially, this is what we take a look at in terms of expectations of future prices. So what happens if we expect the price of these Beanie Babies to increase? So price of Beanie Babies, BBs right here, is expected to increase. Is expected to increase. So that's the specific shock to this example. The general shock is that these expectations that future prices will rise is a general one. That future prices will rise. So with this one, if you are a firm or if you are a sort of producer of these Beanie Babies, and you expect the price of them to increase later on, what are you going to do with these collectible stuffed animals? Are you going to want to go ahead and flood the market with the Beanie Babies right now, or are you going to want to hold onto them and hoard them in the hopes of getting these higher prices? You're going to want to go ahead and do the latter here. You're going to want to go ahead and hoard onto them as much as you can because you want these higher prices in the future. So here, if you expect prices to increase in the future and you are a producer or firm in this scenario, you're going to want to hoard them, which tells us that supply is going to decrease. So supply is going to shift in towards the origin. So one thing that we also noticed in this case is that we also did see expectations on the demand side. So anytime we see the same determinant on the supply side and also on the demand side, we will be explicitly clear about what side of the market we are taking a look at. So there's not going to be any confusion with any of this. So we'll say, hey, for the consumers or for the producers, so you know exactly which one of these you need to shift, either the supply or the demand. Next, we go ahead, take a look at number of sellers. Number of sellers. And once again, this is the most trivial one that we take a look at on the supply side, just like what we saw on the demand side. If we have higher population, if we have more sellers, what does this tell us about our supply curve? It tells us that we're going to have more supply. So essentially, supply is going to increase. Shift away from the origin. So once again, most trivial one, I'm not going to go ahead and draw a graph out of this. It's going to be just a shift of the supply curve away from the origin. And then the final two determinants that we go ahead and take a look at, I'll build this up on a new page right here. We take a look at taxes and subsidies. So this is exactly where taxes are going to be affecting our marketplace. It's not going to be on the demand side, it's going to be on the supply side. So anytime we talk about taxes, it's going to shift our supply curve. And do corporations, do they like taxes? Obviously not. Nobody likes taxes. Why don't they like taxes? Because anytime a tax is going to be imposed, it raises the cost of doing business. Raises the cost of doing business. So what does this mean? It tells us that anytime the government is going to levy a tax on the production or sale of a particular item, it's going to affect the supply side, and that's going to shift our supply curve over to the left. So here, S0 over to S1, so taxes increase. Firms and corporations are going to be affected by that, so supply goes down. Supply is going to shift over to the left. So here, once again, be explicitly clear, taxes affect the supply side of the market, they do not affect demand. And then finally here, our final determinant are going to be the subsidies. And subsidies are basically just the opposite of these taxes. So essentially the government can give a subsidy to a firm or corporation, and that's just going to be monies that the government gives to this firm or corporation in order to conduct or in order to do a particular task. So money given to firms to undertake a task. So if firms hate taxes, they actually love these subsidies. So we see a lot of these subsidies in the agricultural industry, and we want to go ahead and see what happens when the government is going to levy some type of subsidy. So go here at 0. What do you think is going to happen to our supply curve? Is subsidies increase? Let me write that better. Subsidies increase. So if subsidies increase, what does this do for the supply of a particular good or service? It's going to increase the supply curve, shift it over to the right, away from the origin. So here, taxes and subsidies, they're basically opposites from one another. Firms hate taxes, but firms love subsidies. So essentially, these are all the determinants of supply that we have taken a look at. And now you have a little bit of a better intuition of exactly how all of these things are going to shift. Of course, go ahead, do the opposite cases to see exactly what happens in the opposite case, just to get that extra practice. But essentially, we tackled all of these determinants of supply within this lecture. So product technology, we take a look at the cost of resources, the prices of related commodities. This is probably the most confounding one out of all of them. Expectations about future prices. We take a look at the number of sellers. And then finally, of course, taxes and subsidies. So in the final sort of idea in terms of supply that we need to go ahead and take a look at is to go ahead and take a look at the differentiation between a change in supply and a change in quantity supplied. But once again, the discussion about this is going to follow very, very closely to what we saw in terms of the demand side. So see you guys as we wrap up the supply side of this lecture.